Nutrient absorption takes place in the small intestine for the most part. So when we look at the small intestine, it has a very large surface area. So you remember that the small intestine has a smaller diameter than the large intestine, but it is actually longer. And it also has specific adaptations that increase the surface area of our small intestine. So let's look at where the small intestine is first located. So it's in the abdominal cavity. And you can notice here that the stomach connects to the first part of the small intestine, which is the duodenum or the duodenum. And this is actually where we get a lot of chemical digestion, because this is where the pancreas releases its chemicals, enzymes, into this space in order to digest proteins and lipids and carbohydrates and nucleic acids. So the duodenum is a short part, it's only about 10 inches. Then we have the jejunum, 3 feet, and then we have the ileum, which is 6 feet. So together, that's like 9 feet of intestine. So let's look at some of the adaptations. First, we have folds. So if I draw my folds here, this is going to increase the surface area, as opposed to, say, for example, being a straight line, right? So if my tube didn't have any folds in it, it's not going to have as much surface area. So this is versus this, right? The other thing about the small intestine is that on these folds, there are finger-like projections. And so each of those folds has these finger-like projections, and these finger-like projections are called villi. Villi are only found within the small intestine. And then on the villi, so if I were to look at like one villi, we have, this is lined with epithelial tissue, which is simple columnar epithelial tissue. And so we have these cells that have cilia on them. And so the cilia are actually called the microvilli, and they increase the surface area even more. So when we look at the surface area, it's huge for nutrient absorption. Let's look at a diagram that shows this. This would be the circular folds there. And then on those circular folds, you can see the villi. And then you can see the individual villus fingers. And then the simple columnar, the single layer of column-shaped cells right here that would have villi on their surface. And that increases the surface area even more. So nutrients typically do not go between cells. If they do, that can be very bad. And so when we have inflammation in like the small intestine due to Crohn's or celiac disease, you might hear about those causing inflammation in your small intestine, then nutrients and all kinds of things can leak through the epithelial tissue, and sometimes that's referred to as leaky gut. So we want these epithelial cells to have a tight junction, so only certain things can make it across that barrier. So if we look at the nutrient absorption, we can see that these villi have 2 different structures inside of them. They have a green structure, which is part of the lymphatic system, which we learned about the lymphatic system as it relates to, like, for example, our lymph nodes, but it's also a really important component of the digestive system. Then we have the capillaries, which are part of the cardiovascular system, but the capillaries absorb some certain nutrients, most of the nutrients, in fact, and then transport them out to the rest of the body. So let's look at these, what these nutrients are. So we have nutrients that are water soluble. So that means that they can go in solution. And these are actually would include glucose and amino acids. Glucose is energy. Amino acids would be like the building blocks of proteins. Then we have water insoluble. And these would be like, for example, lipids. So those are two different types of nutrients, and they are dealt with differently. The water soluble nutrients, let's change my here. These are absorbed by the capillaries in the villi. And they are primarily transported to the liver. Why are they transported to the liver? We have a whole lecture on the liver, but the liver functions to store glucose as glycogen. It can take out the amino acids so it can produce its own clotting and factors and other proteins that it needs to produce. And any toxins that are absorbed across the surface of the small intestine can go to the liver, to be broken down. So we then have these water insoluble nutrients, which are the lipids, and these are taken up by the lymphatic system. So they're taken up by the lacteals, and they're actually packaged in a protein kind of coat covering. So they become water soluble, but they're transported in the lymphatic system. So that, say, for example, if you eat a meal, so I'll just put system here. If you eat a meal that is high in lipids, you don't get all those lipids dumped into your circulatory system. They first are kind of diluted by the lymphatic system. So the lymphatic system carries them back to the circulatory system up at the neck after they have been transported through the body via the lymph. And so this is just the two different ways that the nutrients are dealt with and absorbed by the small intestine. Let's look at a diagram that shows this from your textbook. So we're not going to pay attention. You don't need to learn the different ways that nutrients travel, but fructose and glucose can just move across, but notice that they actually have to go into the cell and then out of the cell. So they're not going between the cells. Amino acids also travel this and they go to the liver, right? And then these triglycerides, these would be the lipids, and they are packaged in structures called chylomicrons. And then they go to a lacteal, and then they eventually get put back into the circulation at the subclavian vein region, which is up in your neck. So this is a diagram that shows that absorption. This is kind of a cool diagram because it shows how the hepatic portal, which means liver, goes up to the liver, and then where the blood and the nutrients are filtered, and then back to the heart, where it is then pumped out to the body, whereas the lymphatic system transporting the lipids goes up here and gets put back into circulation up near the neck region.